Hello and welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is our third and final EdTech Hub Research Hour, and I'm Dr. Taskeen Adam, a researcher at the EdTech Hub, and I'll be the moderator for this session. So today's presentation will be focusing on research around technology to support personalized learning, particularly in low and middle income countries. So just before I kick off, a few housekeeping points. Remember to check out the public agenda. We still have a few great events happening for the rest of today. And we really strongly encourage you to interact as much as possible. We have the chat feature and the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom panel. The real true power and potential of such events like this is in bringing people together. So we really encourage you to take up that opportunity. So now moving on to today's topic. Basically, while non-tech personalized learning has existed for some time, there have been advancements in ICT, in data science, and machine learning that have led to real significant growth in the development of tech-enabled personalized learning solutions that can be used at school and at home. And these tech-supported personalized learning opportunities range from smart learning management systems to data-driven decision-making that uses AI to intelligent tutors. Now, while the evidence is emerging on the positive impact of these tech-supported personalized learning solutions, and that they can actually improve student learning outcomes, there are also challenges and issues that are faced in implementing personalized learning, particularly when it comes to low and middle income countries. So today we've organized a session so we can talk more about this. And we have people in the room today from academia, from government, and from the nonprofit spaces who can really share and contribute to this conversation. So in terms of the sort of run of the show for today, each of our panelists will first give a brief presentation, and then we'll move over to a discussion where we can talk about the findings and the trends, and then we'll hand over to the audience and hear some question and answers from you. So we really encourage you to share your questions in the question and answer box below. Now, let me introduce our amazing panelists to you. So first up, we have Tom Kaye, a colleague of mine, and Tom is from the EdTech Hub, and he is the Global Country Engagement Lead. Tom is also undertaking research into how digital personalized learning tools can positively impact learning outcomes in low and lower middle income countries. Then we have Dr. Nathan Castillo, an assistant professor in education policy at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and his research focuses on appropriate uses of technology for learning and assessment. Then we have Ghaida Alrawashdeh. She is a doctoral researcher at the University of Illinois as well, and her research focuses on the use of EdTech to support learning and teaching in resource-challenged contexts. Next, we have Nat Dinham. She is a partnerships lead at onebillion, which is a nonprofit developer of EdTech solutions for early grade literacy and numeracy. And then we have Dr. Joshua Valeta, who is the inaugural director of Open Distance and E-Learning at the Ministry of Education in Malawi. So we really have a great lineup of panelists. And now I'll hand over to Tom. And Tom is going to give us a presentation, which is an overview of what's been learned about how to make personalized learning work in low income contexts. So Tom, I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks so much, Taskeen. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I know that I'm in good hands with you moderating today's session. Thanks so much to yourself, to the mEd Alliance, to all of the other speakers and the attendees. I think it's going to be a great session. I'm going to be giving a very quick 5-minute overview of 3 major pieces of research the EdTech Hub team have undertaken as we explored the digital personalised learning space. Through that, then I'm going to give a little bit of a focus. I think research activities should be focused on going forward. I'll be presenting today on behalf of a number of who have contributed to this research from the EdTech Hub, including Louis Major, Katie Jordan, and a range of others. And you'll see their names and publications that I plan to put into the chat once I've finished the talk. If we could move on to the next slide, please, Kim. So the first piece of research I want to talk about is a rapid evidence review that the EdTech Hub team have conducted. The aim of this review was to conduct rigorous and systematic scoping of the published literature between 2006 and 2020 that focused on digital personalised learning. The systematic review identified and analysed 24 studies from 12 different countries, synthesising both quantitative and qualitative research involving school-age learners. And you see there are three major findings from this piece of research, and that is that digital personalised learning technology has the potential to, number one, close educational gaps for lower attaining students by tapping into the pedagogical and motivational affordance of technology. Number two, the research emphasised the important role of the teacher in implementing digital personalised learning. And then number three, that digital personalised learning can improve learning outcomes, including for out of class and out of school students. Now, this RER really showed how DPL, or digital personalised learning technology, offers the potential to improve educational outcomes, but we need to know a lot more about that potential. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Kim. The second piece of research I want to talk briefly about is a meta-analysis that we conducted on the back of the RER. So once we'd identified this potential, we wanted to dig deeper and understand the impact of digital personalised learning. Now, this meta-analysis involves studies that covered 16 RCTs, randomised controlled trials, in 6 countries. These RCTs involve more than 50,000 learners aged 6 to 15, and it really investigated the effects in different learning domains: mathematics and literacy, personalisation level, so is it high levels of personalisation or low, and also the intervention intensity and duration. And so we have a number of findings there, and I'm not going to go through each one of them because we are very limited for time, but particularly it re-emphasised that text-supported personalised learning can have a really positive impact on learning outcomes when implemented correctly. So that leads me to the third piece of research I'd love to highlight. Kim, if we could move on to the next slide. Now, before you all get shocked when this slide appears, don't try and read everything, okay? Everything, it's very small, but what I really want to emphasize here is that there's a lot of elements that need to come together to be able to drive better learning outcomes through the use of digital personalized learning. Now, what you're seeing on the screen here is a cumulative model that we designed based on interviews with 13 experts from around the world and a review of 18 key resources shared by those international experts. Now, Kim, if we move on to the next slide, I've highlighted some of the key factors here that need to be considered when designing tech-based personalised learning interventions. And you can see there's a range of things from infrastructure to the quality and the type of content, through to the level of the student capacity, through to the actual design of the tools themselves. So there's a lot there to be thought through still. It's not just a matter of having a digital personalised learning tool, passing it to a student, and then you get positive learning outcomes. There's a lot more for people to consider. Now, I know I'm moving quickly as we have limited time, so I might move on to the next slide, Kim. And what we really want to say is that all of this research combined is showing that DPL can have a positive impact on driving better learning outcomes in low and lower middle income countries. However, what we're also learning is we need to do a lot more research to understand why varied impacts occur from trial to trial. So through the rapid evidence review and the meta-analysis earlier that I mentioned, we did identify positive learning outcomes, but we also identified quite a variation in the different learning outcomes. So we need to do more research to understand why this variation occurs. And Kim, we might move on to, I think, my final slide here. Second last slide. The first thing that we want to research and get a bit more of an idea about is what is digital personalized learning. What we found is that the terminology is really diverse, and I think this is something Nathan and Co will speak to later. We often use the same names for different things or different names for the same tool. We need to really get a better feel for what we mean by digital personalized learning and get a consistent nomenclature, a consistent terminological use across our different studies so that we can start comparing apples with apples. Then on to the final slide for me. Thanks, Kim. Sorry, this has been such a rush, but on this slide, we're highlighting a number of things that we still need to learn. And what we're doing at the EdTech Hub is we're taking some of these things, like how does digital personalized learning work, for whom, in which context, and why? How long do learning gains persist? Is digital personalized learning more effective for lower attaining learners or higher attaining learners? What is the best strength, length, and saturation level of interventions? And do these programs offer good value for money? So we're taking these research questions that still require answering at the EdTech Hub, and we're beginning to start some more research to dig into each of those. So this is where we're at for now, but please watch this space, watch the EdTech Hub website and newsletter, and we'll be sure to communicate all of the things that we learned from this point forward with our broader audience. Back to you, Taskeen. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Tom. That's really a lot of information, and we can unpack it a bit more in the discussion. Now I'll hand over to Nathan and Ghaida. So Tom has given us an overview of what we can see in the literature, and Nathan and Ghaida will be talking about what we can see from the market. So they are going to give us an overview of the UNICEF landscape review of Pell interventions in low and middle income countries. So over to you, Nathan and Ghaida.
Great, thank you, Taskeen, and to the rest of the panel for being here and inviting us to be a part of this session with you all. As you mentioned, Taskeen, we're going to be discussing this overview of some research, some exciting research that we're going to be doing, that we are doing with UNICEF right now, with the Office of Global Insights and Policy, on better understanding this phenomenon of personalized learning in low and middle income countries. As you mentioned, this is more of a market scan than a literature review. And if we go to the next slide, I'll go ahead and discuss some of the objectives of this project in particular. It essentially dovetails the work that Tom was just presenting from the EdTech to have this better understanding of how are people talking about or defining personalized learning in these different contexts. We know that there's a lot of hype out there, and we're trying to understand what are the different ways that this is being not only defined, but also addressed in different contexts that have low resources, low connectivity, those kind of contexts. We're trying to, through this research, we're trying to provide a balanced insight to help inform policy discourse. We're also trying to cultivate these partnerships and networks. It's good to see in the chat that there's a lot of not only colleagues from UNICEF, but also colleagues from our external review groups that have contributed to the work that we've been doing so far and helped inform it as we've moved it along. That's a big part of this objective of this project. And then finally, to generate this knowledge at the ecosystem level to ultimately inform this decision-making in implementation and policy for other individuals, other groups, both nonprofits, government entities, researchers that want to also be a part or start thinking about and designing and implementing personalized learning solutions in these contexts. So that's an overview of the objectives. Next slide, please. The scope of the project that we're doing now, it's an in-process research. So I'm happy to discuss some of our preliminary findings during the Q&A session, but just to give you a sense of what we're doing right now, we're in the phase A of the work, which includes understanding how personalized and adaptive learning is being defined across the board, digging into the products themselves through not only key stakeholder interviews with designers, developers, and implementers, but also engaging in the platforms ourselves as students, as teachers, as parents, where they have the information available. So really taking a hands-on approach to understanding the platforms and having a firsthand perspective of what's possible and how different personalized and adaptive learning approaches are being implemented. And then of course, we're trying to identify these trends, but also gaps in the design and implementation of personalized solutions. What can be done, what is being done, and what do we see that is still a little bit lacking that we might want to focus on more as we continue to develop this type of research going forward. And then after we're done with this phase A research, we have a deeper dive at the ecosystem level with a handful of projects that we feel stand out in our phase A phase of the research, and looking at specifically a case study approach to understanding implementation and scale with personalized learning in low and middle income country contexts. Next slide, please. The biggest emphasis for us in this phase A approach and in order to understand and consolidate, synthesize, characterize personalized learning was to come up with an instrument to be able to capture data identify these trends and gaps. And so we did that through an initial approach of looking at what different elements on personalized learning through a literature review are out there. What different rubrics can we find? What can we look at and understand how this is already being categorized in contexts that we're interested in? We looked at about 15 different evaluation indices, rubrics, frameworks to understand that and understand some of the elements that are already being included. And so what we found from this initial approach was that there are variations in focus on learning and pedagogy, as well as technology elements. So what we saw the need was for us in order to create a new instrument through this literature review was to identify a rubric or pull out elements that we think had a healthier balance of focus on learning and pedagogy, as well as tech design and implementation. We were seeing that there was kind of an imbalance between the rubrics that we're looking at. So we said, why not make our own, informed from the literature that's already out there, not recreate the wheel, but combine forces, so to speak, and develop an element that was more specific to the work that we were looking to do. And in the next slide, you can see the result of that, a snapshot of the rubric that we created. This is just kind of a high-level overview. It's the official rubric is over 150 elements of questions, and Nat and others that we reached out to and were persistent in following up with to make sure we understood are familiar with some of the more finite elements of this rubric. But you can see here overall we're looking at issues related to design, use, and inclusivity. And specifically within design, we have a number of elements that we're looking at that are specifically related to pedagogy, including learning design, feedback, student engagement, interaction, teacher presence, which is really important for us to understand as well. And then on the tech design side, we're trying to understand what's going on, what's possible in terms of user access, navigation, interoperability, and importantly, data privacy and those kind of things that are on our minds as we start to think about looking at these more advanced implementations of technology and what that means for privacy and security, especially in classrooms around the world. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but we can dig deeper into that in the discussion. The next slide goes over our criteria sampling and data capture that we conducted earlier this year. Of course, we're interested in looking at learning, but we had to put parameters around what it was that we were looking at, and we decided that primary and secondary were going to be our emphasis. We decided that early education, while it is important and it's growing in its emphasis, might be a little bit limited about what we can do in terms of personalization at early education. So we were specific on primary and secondary classrooms for this research in particular. Of course, the product features had to have some focus on personalization and adaptation, and we can talk about what that meant to us in the discussion section. Importantly, we wanted to make sure that these weren't pilot projects, that there was actual research and data that we could look at and be informed through. And so we were not looking at products that were in their pilot phase, but had a little bit more leverage and sustainability built into them. And from that selection process, on the next click there, you can see that we looked at over 1,000 products to begin with, and then we whittled it down through this criterion sampling approach to about 150 candidates that we thought fit the bill. And then we went through each of those one by one and started working with the different products, talking to people, doing preliminary conversations about what it was that we're looking at, how to align with our research, logging into the different platforms. And we got 40 prominent projects that fit the bill for us and were included in our phase A analysis. And we were intentional about balancing our sample across regions and platform types. And so that, again, with that, we included our desk review, interviews, and product downloads to really engage with the platforms and understand them from a first-hand basis. And so this final slide shows the full list of included projects. Happy to have Nat here with us to talk about 1 billion, which is one of the prominent projects that stood out to us that we included in our research. And with the time remaining in the panel, we can talk about some of those findings that we uncovered from this phase A research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Yes, so from an overview of 40 products to deep diving into 1 billion and its implementation in Malawi. So I'll hand over to Nat and Joshua, who will be talking about the effort to scale effective EdTech to every child in Malawi with a focus on foundational literacy and numeracy skills. So over to you guys.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me on the panel. I'm Nat. I'm from 1 Billion, which is a non-profit organization. We're based in the UK and Nigeria, and we develop comprehensive EdTech solutions for marginalized children, including One Course, which is an adaptive numeracy and literacy software, and One Tab, which is a dedicated educational device to deliver one course to children in challenging environments. And we work with partners all around the world. And we've been partnered since 2013 with VSO International, the Malawi Ministry of Education, and the University of Nottingham under the Unlocking Talent initiative in Malawi, which delivers our One Course software to over 200,000 children in Standard 2 throughout government schools. And last year, we were tasked by the Ministry of Education to develop a plan to accelerate the scale of unlocking talent to reach every single child. And at this point, we worked with the EdTech Hub in a sandbox to iterate the plan, consulting teachers, government, and logistics experts. Next slide, please. So the plan we proposed to the ministry is a hybrid model, which embraces the opportunities of both school and home learning. And this builds on a large-scale pilot that Unlocking Talent ran last year in Malawi, where One Tabs were distributed to households for children to learn at home during the COVID school closures, and during which we saw very good levels of engagement by the children on the tablets. So in this hybrid model, children use the tablets at home to learn maths and reading in Chichewa, or in English optionally, but mostly in Chichewa. And crucially, they learn at their own pace with this adaptive software. Caregivers are responsible for keeping the tablets charged up and making sure they're accessible every day to the children. And then at school, teachers also have a One Tab, which they can use for a variety of teaching supports. And this includes access to a digital library, just using the child-focused software with children, perhaps for remedial support, or maybe in small group work. And they can also use our recently launched digital assessment to get rapid insights into the reading and maths levels of individual children. Next slide, please. Here you can see One Tab being used in Malawi. So One Tab is an evidence-based solution, and we designed our software for Malawi first before we localized it into other languages for other countries. So we're very excited about the enthusiasm and the desire within the Malawi ministry to scale this to every child, and about how it fits into Malawi's ambitions to embed EdTech throughout the curriculum and the education system. At this point, I was going to hand over to Dr. Joshua Valeta to talk more about that ambition, but very sadly, he hasn't been able to join us. I'm not sure why. I think perhaps connectivity issues. So the next two slides, I think Kim, I'm probably not qualified to talk through them because they're very much from the ministry. But perhaps if we show them, and then maybe later people will be able to follow up with Joshua directly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nat. We've learned a lot from all three of you, all four of you. And we'd really like to look at the comparative analysis between your different research projects. So what I'm going to do is sort of ask questions to the three of you, and you can tell me your reflections from your different research perspectives. So the first question I have is, what are the major barriers and challenges to successful design and successful implementation of personalized adaptive learning in low and middle income countries? So Tom, I'll hand over first to you to tackle this one.
Thanks, Taskeen. And I think that aligns a little bit with the question that Dharmesh was asking in the chat as well, which I think is possibly one of the most important ones that we consider when we think about the implementation of DPL in low and middle income countries. For me, I guess that was that very complex diagram that I deliberately didn't get into talking about that I presented during the slideshow, and that is all of the contextual factors. I think too often we see initiatives being transferred from one context to another in the hope that any learning outcome gains that might have been gained in place A will automatically be gained in place B. And what happens on these occasions is that the contextual factors are not adequately considered. And these contextual factors are many and varied and much longer than we have time to talk about today. But little things like the pre-existing learning levels of students the content may have been particularly aligned with an average learning level of students in one country that might not be as applicable in another country. Or for example, lesson lengths might be a little bit different. So in one country, a lesson length might be 40 minutes, but in another country, it's 30 minutes. And so how do we best integrate in those different environments? I also think, for me, one of the things that we really need to find out more about is that last point. How do we best integrate these technologies into classrooms in the different cultural contexts? We've seen a lot of studies that look at digital personalized learning being used outside or complementary or as remedial learning tools. And I think we actually really need to learn more about how to integrate them best. And I think that is one challenge that we've had so far. How to train teachers, how do we support teachers, both from the digital side of things and the tools, but then how to integrate that into their pedagogical approaches, particularly as many teachers are going through competency-based curricular reforms and other challenges. Thanks, Taskeen. Back to you.
Thanks, Tom. Nat, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I couldn't agree more, Tom. I think this question about contextualization is absolutely key, of course. I mean, two sort of broad things to consider, I suppose, are, I mean, the first one is, I mean, we believe very strongly that the solution, every part of the solution must be focused around the child. It must consider the child at every point. And, you know, so for us, that obviously starts with the software, and then it also needs to consider the implementation model and communication with and co-creation with, you know, all of the other stakeholders who are going to be involved with it. But I think crucially, when we're working in with marginalized children or in particularly difficult contexts, we need to make sure that the solution works, even when there is very little infrastructure or very little scaffolding. I mean, it may be the case that there isn't formal schooling, or if there is, that children can't always attend. And I think sometimes personalized adaptive learning can have a particularly interesting application there as a sort of transition back to formal schooling, because it can, you know, has the potential, and, you know, the research and the evidence will drive us all on this, but it has the potential, I think, for children to, at their own pace, get up to a level where they can sort of reintegrate into school. So I think, I mean, certainly having the child very much at the center of all of the design decisions, to make sure that it's going to work for them. Again, I mean, on a sort of practical level, if they don't have internet, if they don't have a digitally literate adult to hand to help them, then, you know, the software needs to take them through, you know, teach them essentially on tablet usage, and make sure that they're never left without knowing what to do, I think. I think the second thing, which is really related to this, but is a separate point, is that, I mean, there's always going to be quite a big barrier to success if the implementation model hasn't included the voices of other stakeholders who are going to be using it. And this would typically be caregivers or teachers, or maybe both. And we've certainly learned a lot from quite small pilots, really, in Malawi, in Kenya, in other places, where we've had focus groups and just asked a lot of questions. And you know, obviously quite a lot of what comes back is you know, sort of common sense and quite sort of simple to get right, but you need to be asking the right questions in the first place. And just a very quick example, I think we've found from the community learning initiative in Malawi, so quite a few, I think about 650 families, all using one tab at home. And of course, as you would expect with technology, there's an initial high level of enthusiasm. It's a really, you know, it's a brand new device, it's doing something new, it's very exciting. And then of course, typically there's a little bit of a drop off a bit later on. And to really sort of keep both children and parents and other members of the community engaged, you need to sort of understand A, what the sort of practical daily barriers are to them using the technology, and B, maybe what other incentives perhaps the software or other parts of the implementation plan could have to sort of keep nudging them. But crucially, I think understanding from the community how you could sort of most seamlessly layer this onto existing daily habits so that it's not going to be disruptive. It's going to be easy for them to continue doing even after that first enthusiasm has worn off. Is I think really important.
Thanks so much, Nat. So just looking at some of the things you guys have mentioned, the context is important, support systems are important, looking at how to co-create implementation models, how to make sure daily barriers have been overcome. Ghaida, looking at the study of over 40 products, what are your preliminary findings in terms of the barriers and challenges?
Well, again, this is just based on the preliminary results, but I would say the major barriers that we were able to identify are mainly equity and access barriers. We have very few products that are currently being implemented in rural contexts. We also have, I would say half of the products actually don't allow offline access. We have very few products, I think about 3 products that can be used via a feature phone. And as you know, there are some parts in the world where access to internet or data or even a smartphone, tablets, desktop is not always feasible. So having products that are, that can be accessed offline or are, feature phone friendly would, guarantee greater access to learners in MICs. Also, we've also noticed that there is a need for more products that are open source and have openly licensed content to provide access to learning environments like advanced courses, simulations, and stuff like that. That otherwise wouldn't be, available to learners in low and middle income countries. We've also noticed that there is need for, features that are specific for differently abled learners. Very, 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 very few products have been, have added those kind of features. And I would say lastly that, I would say that an equity approach to PAL would also require mobilizing a wide range of partners, and that would include the private sector to bear some of the costs that usually the parents or the schools bear.
Thanks so much, Ghaida. So I want to pick up on one point that Nat mentioned, which was about centering the learner. And the bottom line of all of this is improving learning outcomes. So can you tell me a bit from your research in terms of the extent to which these personalized learning solutions are improving learning outcomes? And touching a bit on the equity point you mentioned, Ghaida, how is this different for different groups of learners? Maybe I'll hand over to Nat first.
Yeah, thanks, Taskeen. We've been lucky to have a lot of external research done on our software, on various iterations of our software, including the adaptive version, which is a slightly newer version than some of our previous software. And we've worked with researchers such as the University of Nottingham and Imagine Worldwide. And we've seen consistently very good, very significant learning gains when children get access to it. But I think perhaps very interestingly, we've also seen that girls, when they use the software, make the same learning gains as boys. And this is particularly interesting in Malawi. Well, no, of course it's interesting everywhere, but in Malawi, typically there is a gender discrepancy which evolves fairly early on in primary school. And this research suggests that being able to learn, on your own, or at least, within that personal space, at your own pace and without pressure, social pressures, can enable children to develop in maths and literacy at the same rate, which is very exciting. A few other sort of quite interesting things that have come out of the research, and not necessarily as formal studies in themselves, but slightly more anecdotal or things that have been sort of recorded and noticed, include that, two things. One is that there's some emerging evidence of sort of improved socio-emotional outcomes from using the software. And again, this may be because children can learn at their own pace. They're not necessarily in that peer pressure environment. I'm not sure, but there are lots of sort of possibilities around this. But there's been a lot of again, anecdotal evidence of children who are out of school feeling more confident to return to school after using the software, of parents having a better understanding of their children's potential because they've seen them achieving things with the software. And lastly, I just quickly mentioned that in both Malawi and more recently in Sierra Leone, we're beginning to see that teachers, through watching the children use the software and seeing the pedagogy that's used in the software, which includes quite a lot of positive reinforcement, praise, encouragement, teachers have quite often taken this out into their own teaching practice. So the teachers are learning something from the software, even though the software is primarily child-focused, which is really interesting.
Thanks, Nat. Nathan, do you want to add on to that in terms of what you've learned about learning gains?
Yeah, I can touch a little bit about what we're seeing. I want to preface my comments with this phase A research that we're doing right now is not intended to evaluate the products, and this is what we were telling the different vendors as well, that we are primarily trying to categorize and characterize and understand trends and gaps. And so while understanding the extent of learning gains was not a primary focus, it was interesting for us from our research to understand how different vendors are capturing information on what they perceive as important in terms of learning gains. And so some of the stuff that we've been seeing that is more prominent is some things that you might recognize from a market perspective. So how number of active users, how many downloads of a platform there are. Those are a little bit more prominent. Although 30 out of 40 of the products that we looked at are looking at improvement in learning gains to some extent, and different aspects of frequency of use and retention, but at a lesser level. Also importantly, one of the questions that we asked on our rubric that you might have seen from the platform or from my presentation is emphasis on evaluation. How are these platforms looking at evaluation? So we see that a majority of them, over half of them, have completed an evaluation. All of them have done a pilot version to some extent. All but one have done a pilot version to some extent. So it's being informed by iteration and input on use and user experience. Like I said, a little bit over half have completed an evaluation, but less than that have done these kind of cost-benefit analysis that are important in terms of personalized learning as well. So we're seeing more of the trends of what different vendors or solutions are prioritizing in terms of the data that they're capturing and how they're able to understand learning from their evaluations or cost-benefit analysis in a meaningful way. And so that's something that we're understanding from impact and learning gains. And like Jade had mentioned, there is, in response to is it impacting different groups of learners differently? Well, we do know that there is less emphasis on some of the issues that are related to inclusivity, which is why we thought it was important to include in our rubric. But we will be digging deeper into that in our phase B research when we do the case study work with a smaller select set of vendors to understand really how that's operating. So that's something that we're importantly looking at through the work that we're doing here.
Thanks, Nathan. Tom, any more input in terms of learning gains, and can you also weave in some of the facts, some of the emerging trends you've talked about? Nathan talked about emerging trends. Can you also weave in a bit about that into your answer?
Yeah, certainly, no problem at all, Taskeen. Thanks. Only one small thing to add on the learning outcome side of things. In the meta-analysis that I talked about in the presentation, we found an overall effect size of 0.18 is the impact of the various tools we looked at. However, it is important to note that that's the average size. The actual effect size varied between negative 0.09 right up to 0.86. So there's a huge diversity efficacy in impact of tools. And I think that comes back to the fact that we have such wide variation in what these tools are. And this is why the typology that Nathan and Ghaida have been working on, and yourself, Taskeen, will be so important to standardize our conception. If I can give one small steer to colleagues who are on the call, when we work closely with governments and we're thinking through with them the kind of EdTech interventions that they might want to integrate into their education systems, we will look for learning impact. We will look for the impact on learning outcomes, but we need to look for a robust way of measuring that. A lot of the studies that we've looked at, they don't even talk about how they measure their learning gains, or they come up with their own tests, or it might be a 5-question test and a pre and post test, and it's not enough to really measure learning gains. For those out there who are EdTech entrepreneurs who really want to generate robust data to support their intervention and support their ability to market that, I highly recommend looking at the various international tests that are out there and how they can be adapted to suit the area that you're in, so that you can say, we have used the EGRA or the EGMA or an adaptation of PISA or TIMS or PEARLS, and we have robust data here on learning outcomes, not something that we've made up out of our pockets. In terms of the trends, and I'll be quick because I know that I've just taken up some of the time on that last time. I think we're already touching on it a bit here. We're seeing people starting to design tools for various different environments, specifically for those who have no power, low power, no bandwidth, low bandwidth. I think we're getting this wide variety of tools that are coming out that are suitable to a whole bunch of different contexts. I think that's really great for the evolution of this sector. I'm also seeing a number of tools now being focused on solely the learning platform itself, and they're taking content, they're curating content from other sources, so they're not focusing on developing their own content. They're focusing on the algorithms, on how they collect data from students to be able to identify how best to order and deliver content, and on the content delivery mechanism versus the content themselves. So we seem to have this split on people who do content and application, content only, or application only. And I think that's a really interesting one. My final steer on this front is, I think there's a lot of really interesting emerging stuff, but we're getting to a point now where we have such a diffuse market that I would hope over time these diffusion of innovators start to come together and combine and move our tools to the next level, so that we don't have 1,000 different tools. We have 100 really high quality ones. And I think that's where the next evolution will be. Thanks,
that's a great point. Thank you so much, Tom. I actually really am excited to hear Ghaida's answer on this question on emerging trends. To me, Ghaida is one of the experts in machine learning and AI when it comes to personalized learning. So Ghaida, please do also tell us a bit about the emerging trends that you're aware of.
Yeah, thanks, Taskeen. One of the trends that we've noticed, again, that's just from the preliminary results, is that we have more products that cater to numeracy as opposed to literacy, since this is what we're interested in this venue. Only 5 products actually cater to literacy. So there's out of the 40 products that we have. So I think there's a need for more products, that are specifically dedicated to literacy. And I think maybe one of the reasons why there's this slack is because there's this misconception about, technology being more beneficial for STEM courses or STEM, subjects. And I think there are a lot of, recent studies right now. They're showing that, they're very also beneficial for, subjects like literacy. And I think, Nathan, you yourself had an intervention in South Africa where you also kind of show that there are gains from using technology for literacy. Also, since you were talking about machine learning and AI, one of the trends that we've also are seeing coming out is that more products are going to be using AI. In fact, most of the products that we've scanned have some kind of an AI enabled component. Most of them focus on machine learning. Very few of them use natural language processing, NLP. And I think NLP could be very useful for literacy or languages. And I'm not seeing a lot of products making full use of NLP. Another thing is I'd say that most of the products are using AI for differentiation, which is basically to offer dynamic adaptation of the progression pathways. This fear that technology is here to replace teachers, and with PAL, there's always this fear that PAL is being used to automate or make decisions about learning without input from teachers, which eventually would minimize their role. But what we're noticing is that I'd say about 85% of the products that we have allow educators to engage in the students' learning process, and that could be through viewing or tracking or monitoring their progress. I would say, however, that we need more products to invest in features that would alert or prompt the teachers to intervene in time. So what we're seeing is that there are live dashboards that the teachers can view, but then the teacher has to take the initiative. They have to take the lead on viewing the progress and then intervening. I think if we have features like a pop-up or maybe a notification sent to the teacher when a student is struggling, to kind of like nudge them to intervene in time would be very helpful. Lastly, I would say that most of the products that we included in the scan did not have a dedicated parent or school leader portal. And I think, from our conversations with the vendors, it seems like they are seeing, there's need for that. And many of them are actually working on it. So I see that as an emerging trend, that more products are going to be having a dedicated parent and school leader portals.
Thanks so much, Ghaida. Actually, I want to pick up on some of the questions from the audience. So Dharmesh asked the question, one of the biggest challenges faced in the Western world is around safeguarding. So how is this factored into the service delivery of minors? I also want to add a bit of my own spice to that question, and wonder if you could also talk about ethical issues when it comes to AI and biasing issues. Ghaida, I know you know a lot about biasing issues, so do you wanna tackle that as well quickly, because we don't have much time left, so quick 1-minute answers from you guys.
Sure. One concern about many of AI-based PAL solutions is that they suffer from potential sample selection bias, where the data is collected in a manner that would undersample certain communities and oversamples others. So ideally, the data set that you're going to use to train the model should either be completely random or at least acknowledges the different characteristics of the end users, and that would include their backgrounds, experiences, demographics. And in fact, if I have time, more than 180 human biases have been defined and classified by psychologists. We're talking about 180. So these biases could seep into machine learning algorithms when designers knowingly or unknowingly introduce them to the model, or when the training data itself is not complete, it's not comprehensive, it's not large enough. And again, an AI system can be as good as the quality of the input data, and who inputs the data? Humans. And so if we can clean the training data set from conscious or unconscious assumptions about race, gender, or any other ideological concept, I think we will be able to build an AI system that can make unbiased data-driven decisions. And I can say more about how to minimize that, but for the in the interest of the time, I'll leave that to the chat maybe.
Thanks, Ghaida. So I think a last question from Papa in the chat, who says, so you've spoken about personalized learning with regard to formal learning. Is there a consideration for how EdTech and personalized learning can be used in a community learning model that involves parents, children, and teachers? And Tom, you've emphasized this point about teachers and integrating them into the model. Do you want to take a stab at that first? Quick 30-second answers.
Look, I think it's a really interesting one. I have to admit, what I've actually seen more of is that there's a lot of out of school, I think I mentioned before, out of school interventions using digital personalized learning. And so I think there has been research done in that space, and more than happy to share some of that after today. And what that research has shown, anecdotally from the top of my head, is that there is a lot of use for this. I actually think, though, this is something that Nat might be able to provide a bit more input on, given the different models that 1 billion have been exploring. So rather than take up more time, I might pass over to somebody far more knowledgeable than I.
Great, Nat. And Nat, I think there's the at-home space and the school space, but there's also that middle community space, and I think that's what the question is about.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I mean, and yeah, right. What we did in Malawi originally last year was very much a home-based model, and then and crucially, we work through a lot of other partners, and they've been developing their own models for their own context. But I think certainly this essentially a sort of shared community model is something that we're very interested in looking into more, not just for Malawi, but other areas. Particularly because I think it offers this opportunity for more people to get involved in children's education. I mean, children, they'll be using the software to learn, of course, but then there are opportunities for them to showcase what they've learned, for other children to come and get involved, maybe on the same tablet, and for them to learn together and create make their own creations, drawings, for example, and stories, but also obviously to show what they've learned and share their skills. So I mean, to be honest, I'm just thinking that there are so many different models that are already being planned or in use by our partners all around the world. But I think essentially, I mean, the crucial part of this really is that the community is behind the behind the intervention. What I mean by that is not just that they sort of that they're bought into it, but really that they're involved from the very beginning in what it should look like. Because I think how many tablets per community, where they're kept, who's in charge of charging them up, of making them available. Do you need a little bit more sort of learning support, maybe from someone who has a bit of an educational background, or is that not necessary? What age group is it? Do some children need a bit of extra help for various other reasons? All of these considerations will help shape the details of the model. But I know one of our partners has a very interesting model going on at the moment in a refugee camp in Lebanon, where they have a sort of lending library of one tab. So children take the tablet home for about a school term and use it with all of their friends and their siblings, and then return it, and someone else gets to use it, which is very simple and seems to be working quite well in that particular context.
Thank you so much, Nat. So unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. This has really been a super engaging and invigorating session. We've learned so much. And I think really the key highlights here are looking at that integration model. I love the ideas about community, about bringing the parents, the schools, the teachers all into this. We've also looked at equity issues. How does this work for students in rural areas? We've looked at, Tom mentioned different devices that are being designed in different ways to actually help these more marginalized learners have access to personalized learning. So I think there's lots of exciting things to look forward to in this space. And I think really now the focus going forward is looking at the what, the how, the who, looking at those minor details in terms of actually implementing. And I love something that Tom mentioned earlier in his speech. He said, when implemented correctly. And that's such a key term for personalized learning being a success. So hopefully more research will be go into looking at those aspects. So I'd really love to thank all of the panelists today. You guys have been an amazing bunch. And I think, we definitely need many follow-up sessions. I think we need like a 1 hour with each of you, because there's just so much to get through. So thank you again, and thank you to the audience. We try to get reply to your questions as well. Let's see, some of them have been answered in text, so that's great. But have a lovely rest of the day, and thank you for joining.